Evangelism is a role that's coming out and becoming much more popular and important at tech companies. It's really just deeply understanding your product at a technical level and then working with technical people to help them understand it and implement it effectively.
Today on the podcast, we have the pleasure of being joined by Andrew Madson, who is, aside from being a LinkedIn influencer with like 80,000 followers, so if you're not following him there already, you got to. He is a tech evangelist over at Dremio. His work focuses on bridging the gap between theoretical knowledge and the real world application. He is huge into data science and a really big figure talking about a lot of things happening that I think are very influential on AI and everything happening in the field of data science and analytics. So welcome to the podcast today, Andrew.
Thanks for having me, Jaden.
Okay, so super excited to have you on the show. I would love to first off start by talking a little bit about what got you into the space, into data analysis or analytics, all of this stuff that's happening now. How did you kind of get started?
Yeah, I used to be a finance executive focused on legal and regulatory compliance. And I found myself having to make a lot of decisions regarding people's jobs and risk management, which included a lot of data analysis. And I couldn't get my head around the data, and I didn't feel super comfortable making those decisions. So I really had to dive deep into statistics, which then led me into data analytics, and I just loved it. So then I worked on making it my full-time job.
Okay. So had you done, I know with data and analytics and analysis and all this kind of stuff, it feels very much more like kind of like technical almost. I don't know, are you a developer? Would you call yourself like a developer, or are you more just kind of working on,
I started as a developer learning SQL, R, Python, and doing that for several years, and then moved into leadership. Mm-hmm. But they don't respect you unless you keep those skills up.
Yeah.
So I still try to stay technical.
That's hilarious and awesome. And actually something I've heard quite a few people talk about, it's the challenge of moving from when you're technical, going into management, but you don't really have a lot of time to be doing the technical stuff. How do you stay up to date on stuff? Do you have projects or things you work on or play with, or what do you do to stay?
I found it easier because I came from being in leadership before I went into data. So leadership was always easier for me. And when I was learning data, I had to learn at night anyway. Mm-hmm. And so going from being an individual contributor to then leading data teams and data organizations was much more natural for me. But I always keep my hands on the keyboard when it comes up to projects and staying up to date with those. So the projects really are internal. I don't have to go look outside and figure out there's a new skill, a new library. Let me figure out a way to implement this. I just make sure that I stay involved at my companies.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's so interesting. So you mentioned, you kind of started not exactly in this. You were in finance doing, things there. Moving in, what were some of the biggest challenges you faced? What were the kind of things that you're like, oh my gosh, this is harder than it looks?
Learning to code was hard for me, but it is just like learning a new language. I had zero experience with it and decided to start with just getting a master's degree in it, which wasn't a great idea because they assume that you have a strong foundation before you start the program. Uh-huh. But it's also moving from one industry to another is difficult because I already was coming from a high-paying role and didn't have any experience in data analytics, so I couldn't just switch right over. Mm-hmm. I couldn't afford at that time to just take a entry-level role. Mm-hmm. So I took a mid-level data job at night, and I literally worked 2 full-time jobs for years. So I was building my second resume, my data resume, to the point where I could get a data job that could fully replace my income. So that was a challenge for a few years, which I don't recommend, but I have had a conversation with several, high level folks in other industries who are trying to transition into data and do run into that problem of they don't have the experience to get a data job that can fully replace their income. How do they do it? I'm like, well, this is how I did it. Not recommended, but if you really want to break into something, if you really want to do something, there's going to be sacrifice on some end.
That is a fascinating idea. I've talked to a lot of people that are and I'm sure you get this in data a lot, but like with AI, they're like, like I really want to get into like the AI industry. I want to become like a developer or a researcher and like work on this stuff. They're like, but I have like no experience. And like, yeah, I have a job somewhere else, sometimes at a great tech company or other places. And that is such an interesting path. You say you wouldn't recommend it, doing like a side job pretty much to do it. Is that just because like it's so time consuming?
It was. I literally was working from 5 a.m. to midnight every day, 6 days a week, for 2 years. And I think if you want to accelerate your path to getting in, I think that's the amount of time it takes to really get in. You can do volunteer projects. If you just want to be associated with it, 100%, you can just do less work than that. You can volunteer for free. You can get an internship. You can do your little projects. But if you really want to get in and make it your full career, it does take quite a bit of time and experience.
Yeah. So you're doing this kind of like part-time thing. You get a bunch of experience. What was your first hop into, I guess, moving into like a full-time role in data?
I took over a data team. I can't remember what company I was at. I don't know. I've been at so many companies. I've switched jobs like 20 times.
I was looking at your LinkedIn and I was noticing, I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy's been everywhere.
It was. Yeah, but I took over some data teams and I took over a small team at first. And that was good because it keeps your hands on the keyboard. Like there weren't enough people. There were probably like 3 analysts. And so then I also was having to do full-time work while managing the team. And so it keeps you fresh, it keeps you sharp. But then I was able to introduce like project management and prioritization into that organization, which a lot of data teams struggle with because they're a limited resource. And then they get into like the order taking role of, okay, here's a project, let's work on it. Here's a project, let's work on it, rather than taking the time to think strategically.
Talk to me a little bit about you had that job, you've been in companies doing this for a while, and then I don't know if you switched or I've noticed you've done a bunch of stuff with academia. You've worked at a bunch of universities, being an instructor there. What's like the differences, or what are some of the nuances between like doing this in an actual company versus teaching it?
Yeah, it depends on the company and on the course. A lot of the courses are dated. They're definitely not at the forefront of the technology, where a lot of companies aren't either, if we're being frank, but most tech companies, the big tech, are at the forefront of the technology. So what you're learning in school, even in grad programs, is really more foundational, but you're going to have to do more learning outside of that to really excel in a forward tech company. But for 99% of like the Fortune 500s, which aren't at the forefront of technology, you'll be just fine. Grad programs really focus on like the fundamentals, clustering, regression, transformers, where these days, like I'm not teaching RAG at all in my courses, but you really do need to, if you want to be an AI, you do need to know how RAGs work and how to build them. At the very least, their architecture, which isn't being covered in most school programs.
So where do people learn that?
YouTube. I think if you want to learn new concepts, you should always go back to the initial academic paper. Whoever created the technology and first wrote about it, that's the best place to start learning.
That's fascinating. And also, I feel like that's a trend in university and school for like literally anything. I know, I studied marketing, and I will say 90% of what I took away from like college that I learned about marketing was like, I'd be doing a class and it's like, whatever. But then I was doing like a side project while I was in school, and I was just using YouTube to learn everything to do with it. And it was coming from the classes. I would say a good 80% of it at least, probably.
Oh, 100%. Josh Starmer, who runs StatQuest, he worked at Lightning AI for a couple of years, figuring out PyTorch Lightning and how to build all those models. But he will literally on YouTube show you how to build a RAG model. So you can just build it yourself. Just follow his step-by-step tutorial.
That's amazing. What's something that you're most excited about that's coming out, that's new, some new innovation in the field that you're most excited about?
I really love where I work at Dremio. We're a data lakehouse company where you can do analytics and AI just right on the data lake rather than having to port it into a data warehouse. You've got stale data, it's expensive, all of that. At ASU, when we were kicking off AI with OpenAI, they have copies of the data in the data warehouse. The data quality is fairly poor because there's changes in upstream systems. It's decentralized data, and now they're trying to build AI on top of it. So that was one of the challenges. And then to build AI on top of it, now they were making another copy. They were all trying to agree on, okay, what's the data? What does it mean? Let's now build out these tables or these cubes and have the AI train on this. Super costly and very inefficient. Whereas with a data lake house, you can do the analytics and AI right on the raw data or on virtualizations of that data, which is super important for real-time AI or real-time analytics. And it's also cheaper, which is a huge benefit. So because Apache Iceberg and other columnar table formats have rolled out and made it possible to do this work on data lakes, it's really expanded and accelerated the pace at which we can build and train AIs on the source data. So I'm seeing a lot of companies being able to roll out AI and LLM programs super fast without having to build a ton of infrastructure around it, which historically, even a year ago, they really would have had to do.
Mm-hmm. Talk to us a little bit about the difference between data lakes and data warehouses and the pros and cons.
A data lake can hold any kind of data. So it's unstructured. It can hold semi-structured and structured data, but you just drop it all into Azure or GCP or Amazon. You just throw it in the data lake. It just lives there. It's raw data. Traditionally, what you had to do then, because you couldn't really use the raw data, it wasn't a format that analysts or data scientists could make use of. So data engineers would go in and format it and then pipe it into a data warehouse, which was much more organized. It's purely structured data. Now you can run your models or your analytics on top of this data warehouse. Problem is, the data warehouse is now stale because you've had to move it from one place to another. It's expensive because it's a physical copy of the data. So now you've got it living in two places. So there could be a mismatch between what lives in the lake, which is where the source systems are feeding, and what's in the warehouse. Warehouses were really great for structuring data. They still are great. They can play nice together, but there are some downsides to it. You couldn't really do analytics on the data lake because it was difficult to use. Also, accessing it. When you run a query on a warehouse, it's super structured, so you can access that data easily. It's easy to find, select from where. But with the invention from Netflix of Apache Iceberg, it's a table format where you don't have to read billions of rows of data. It's columnar. So it can omit tons of the data when you're doing a query, which now makes it possible to efficiently access data within the data lake, which is where all the source systems are dropping that data anyway. It's just now you can use it without having a whole process for restructuring it, copying it, and moving it into a separate place.
That's amazing. Obviously, some huge innovation that unlocks a ton. Tell me about what got you excited about working with Dremio to begin with, and what you're working on now there.
I felt like it was a job that I made for myself. Evangelism is a role that's coming out and becoming much more popular and important at tech companies. They've historically had developer relations, which has been much more on the like writing manuals, writing release documentation side, where evangelism is much more on the product promotion, understanding use cases for the hands-on developers, working with developers and speaking to them about how they can best implement the technology for their specific use cases. But it's nice because it's not sales, it's not marketing, it's really just deeply understanding your product at a technical level and then working with technical people to help them understand it and implement it effectively. So a big part of that is, like you said, LinkedIn, YouTube, stuff I've been doing for free for years.
Right.
I'm like, oh, this can be a full-time job, like just making YouTube videos and LinkedIn content for a product that I think is really great to an audience that I understand and have worked with a lot. So it's a really fun job that you see a lot more companies starting to roll out evangelism, and they're pulling folks off LinkedIn who are posting technical content and building communities because they're like, oh, this is what we want to do. We want to build communities around our product. We want people who deeply understand the issues that developers are facing, and we need to convey that in a way that's not super salesy, but also technically competent.
No, I think it's so important. And also the issue is, like, of course, me coming from my marketing background, yeah, like you can, if you give me a product and I understand it and it's kind of like direct to consumer and it's consumer focused, yeah, easy. We'll make content about how to use it. It's great, whatever. But as soon as it gets to be like a really technical thing that like I don't personally understand, all of a sudden I'm like, yeah, I'm having to talk to developers every day. Like, okay, how does this actually work? Who's actually using this? Like, what do they do? And they explain it. I don't even understand their explanation. And you have to have a person like yourself, who's an evangelist, who you understand it from a technical perspective, because your target audience is technical people. The marketing team isn't really going to understand that, right? And so, yeah, I think you're 100% right. This is going to be a role that we see a lot more going forward into the future. Tell me about some areas in AI that you're most excited, just kind of like generally innovation that you're excited to see.
I think AI can help with a lot of areas that are kind of nuts and bolts. One is data quality. We've seen AI be able to first categorize data and be able to build, automatic semantic layers so that the technical side and the business can now speak the same language at scale, which is super important and incredibly difficult to do manually. Data quality, AI can highlight outliers in data quality, which when you're building an LLM system is super important, because when you're training on billions of tokens, you can have malactors inject, pretty nefarious things into your data that now you've trained on, and they'll hold you ransom for some Bitcoin to tell you what it is, which is happening. But AI can help you identify that and pull it out. Also in education, it's really making professors much more effective, because it can take off a lot of their administrative tasks. It can help them re-envision their lessons, create visuals, be much more impactful with their students, and it empowers students to get a lot of the grunt work off of their backs. It can help them brainstorm. It's like a study partner. So I think it's really going to transform education, as we saw with the recent OpenAI announcements with Chat GPT 4.0.
Yeah, totally. 100%. Yeah, a lot of innovation going down. What are some common misconceptions that people have right now that they're just getting wrong in this field? I think with something so new, there's so much hype. There's so many people talking about stuff. What are some things people are just getting wrong on this?
Well, AI has been around for a long time. Like we say like AI, but what they really mean is generative AI, which has also been around not for a long time, but it's been around for a while. Like ChatGPT 3 has been out for like a long time. It's just 3.5 was accessible. It's also not magic, and it's really just math underneath. And so I think we get that wrong a lot of times, especially business leaders. They're really looking for a silver bullet or a shortcut, which AI really isn't. It can be super helpful, but if you build it on top of a bunch of junk, it's not going to be helpful. So having a strong foundation that these processes, these math, this technology can pull on, and will be helpful. But if you have a bunch of flimsy junk, crappy data quality, business units that have different definitions for their KPIs, AI is going to make the problem worse.
That's so interesting, because so often we hear the pitch like AI is going to fix like literally everything, but you're saying in some cases this is actually making the issue worse. What are things people should be looking out for to avoid that?
It's the business fundamentals. It's, do we speak the same language with our data? Is our data strong? Is it consistent? When we say like a customer, what do we mean? Like, do we all mean the same thing when we say customer? Is it an account? Is it somebody who formerly had an account? Is it an organization? Is it an individual? Different business units will define that differently. So if now the CEO is using an LLM and saying, tell me how many customers we have, what does customer mean? Make sure that that's buttoned up before you start AI.
That's so interesting. And also I think super, super critical. A question I would love to ask you about, sort of related, sort of unrelated. In general, we talk a lot about, this data, it's getting fed into AI. The models are, becoming better and better. What's your opinion on, companies like, let's say, OpenAI, who are working towards AGI? What's your opinion on when this arrives, how possible this is, and maybe some of the data needs that would be needed to actually achieve this? What are some of the things people aren't thinking about?
Yeah, this comes up a lot. I think the definition of AGI varies from company to company, and I think it's good to have that goal. I mean, if OpenAI isn't shooting for AGI, then what are they shooting for, right? Like if your whole model is to build the best AI, and we define AGI as the best AI, then that's really what you should be working towards. Whether or not it's feasible, I don't know. But I think we can get pretty dang close. And I think that what we're going to see is, instead of these giant generalized models like, ChatGPT 4 and 4.0 and Gemini, which you can ask it any question about any topic, I think we're going to see much more niche AIs, which know everything about a certain topic or a certain task. I think that we're going to see a lot more of niche AI tools strung together than more of these enormous general proprietary models.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but based off a bunch of leaks that I think happened last year for OpenAI, when they were like leaking some models and weights and stuff for a GPT-4, they were saying that GPT-4 technically was like 16 experts or something inside of the model that it's like sending different places. Do you think, like, if we're doing these big general purpose models, that's where it goes to, where you just have more and more of these kind of like sub models doing things? Talk to us about what that looks like.
Yeah, that could be a way to do it, where you've got niche models which are experts on certain things, and then you have an overall model which chooses which model to query. That could be a way to do it. But I think the overhead of building that would be so hard that there's not going to be a lot of competition in those areas.
Yeah.
Where I've seen a lot of AI companies grow is in these niche models where, hey, we're going to be the best Python model that there is. We're going to be the best. I saw one the other day that takes textbooks and turns it into like quizzes or exams. And that's all this AI does, but it's super good at it. I think that's where it could be going, like the App Store.
Yeah. No, 100%. I agree. That's why I'm building AI boxes, because fundamentally I believe, OpenAI is great. Gemini is great. There's going to be 1,000, probably at some point, 1 million different AI models, and they're all going to be good at different things specifically. But like, if I'm doing Java or if I'm doing Python, I just want the best Python model. And maybe you have access to proprietary data because you had some Python community forum network that you were able to grab and you pulled them offline and people aren't training on them. And you have this data. You can make this incredible model that maybe other people can't. Monetize it. And I think that you'll be able to beat it. But my one question, or maybe like apprehension in this, is like, what about like synthetic data? Do you think that, yes, you can train to be very specific at good things. At what point does OpenAI just say, forget it, we're not licensing anyone's data anymore, we're just going to create synthetic data?
Somebody asked me this question the other day about the pros and cons of using synthetic data to train models, because they felt that there was a lack of training data. I don't think there is a lack of training data. My opinion on using synthetic data to train models, it's like the blind leading the blind. I think once you get some error in the synthetic data, now we've trained a model and that model's going to create more synthetic data and it exacerbates the error. That's my opinion on it. I just don't think we have a limit to the amount of data that's not synthetic that we could train on. I wouldn't use synthetic data to train, but I'm also not in charge of OpenAI. But I have seen there is a large rise in creating synthetic data to train not just AI, but ML models.
Yeah.
I do see the need for ML models, just because there are times where you're trying to identify outliers where there's a very small sample size. For instance, financial services, they try to find insider trading. That's one of their like risk models. But there's not a lot of examples of like, here's 1,000 insider trading cases. And here's
you
all
busted 5 guys. So.
Yeah, like in 100 years, you found 5, and here's the data around that. So maybe you build synthetic data around that and you train on it to the best of your ability. I have done that. I think with AI, there's not a limit to the amount of data you can train on. That's my opinion.
Do you think that there's untapped data, like places that people aren't thinking about? Because oftentimes it's like, so OpenAI is training their Sora video model and everyone's like, do you guys train with YouTube? And they're like, you're not going to say anything. And everyone's like, okay, you guys are training with YouTube. Like, so there's these like public things like YouTube, right? Huge data set. People are training off of it. Are there companies or places with mass amounts of data that's not public that are going to be really valuable and useful in the future?
Yeah, there are data marts out there that specifically take data that's hard to get or hard to organize. It's becoming more easy, but video's hard to organize and to train on. A lot of this data is like scraped. So the average person can't go and scrape the internet. So a lot of these companies made their model by scraping the internet and organizing the data and then turning around and selling it. Axiom is a big company which really collects all the publicly available data on people. They want to know absolutely everything about a person, for better or for worse. And they're super good at it. And they sell that data to companies. Tons of companies that I've worked for have bought Axiom data for marketing. So like if your name matches something in the Axiom data set, now they know like 100 different data points on you, and they can build a model about like what are you most likely to buy. I think that's going to grow and grow the better and more easily accessible some of this unstructured data is.
Where do you think some of the biggest opportunities are in the market today based off of the players and the landscape and kind of what's going on?
I really think that Hugging Face is doing amazing things with their open source models and empowering developers to build their own GPT models for whatever use case that they have. I think that we put a lot of hope into the huge proprietary models, which are super good and very impressive. And I have subscriptions to all of them. So clearly I love them. But I think open source is underrated right now, and that the crowdsourcing power of taking these open source models and building something amazing is something that we have yet to see, but I think is coming.
Do you think, as far as the landscape going forward into the future, we ever get to a point where some of these open source models are better than these closed source? There's of course, all the controversy of OpenAI, and they were open source and they went closed source and whatever. And people are like, well, it's because they need so much money. And then there's like Google and Meta. So you have these like huge people. Are we ever going to be able to compete? Are people going to create open source things that compete realistically with that?
I think so. I think it's similar to the machine learning paradigm that we went through when in like 2008 to 2000, I'd say like 16, like regulated industries like financial services, healthcare only used SaaS and products like that because it was closed. It was quote unquote reliable and explainable, and they wouldn't use Python or R for their machine learning models because they're like, ooh, open source, we can't verify it or trust it. But now none of them in Europe they'd still do, but a lot of companies don't really use SaaS anymore. One, it's super expensive, and two, you can replicate or make it better with R or Python, which are open source. So I think we're going to go through that same shift with AI, where right now, like, we have to trust the proprietary models because they're so advanced and there's explainability and trust behind it. But I think we'll get to the point where open source is just as good or better than the proprietary models.
Who do you think are going to be some of the biggest winners in the next, let's say, 3 years? So I used to say like 5 years on stuff. I'm like, that's too long. Next 3 years, what are some of the companies that you think are going to be the best winners? We've seen incredible run-ups with NVIDIA. Are they going to be challenged? Incredible run-ups with a lot of different companies. Apple has yet to really announce a serious ChatGPT competitor or anything like that. Are they going to jump in the race? How do you predict the landscape? What do you think the players are going to be doing?
Yeah, I think Apple's an interesting one because we don't super know what they're doing, but they tend to be late to market on almost everything that they do, but they integrate it so well into their ecosystem that I would imagine that that's going to be the same for their LLMs. Whatever they do, it's going to work seamlessly with their ecosystem, and that everybody who has an Apple product is going to use it. That's just how Apple rolls. I think we've underestimated Google because of some of their issues that they had with their releases. But I think Google has some of the absolutely smartest people on the face of the earth cranking on this. And we've seen some folks have to leave Google because of those missteps that they've taken. So I think their fire is really lit under them, even though they are big and move a little bit slower than some of the upstarts. I don't think we've seen the best of Google. And I would love to see a challenger to NVIDIA. I love NVIDIA, but they kind of have a monopoly, which I don't love. I love that they're crushing it, but I think that when there's a monopoly, there's no innovation.
Yeah.
So I hope there's somebody out there who's going to challenge NVIDIA, because then the consumer wins.
You know what? Something interesting you said that I actually think is a great point with Google is like, they had a bunch of missteps, so they have a fire lit under them. I actually would rather Google be in that position than, like, let's say Google just came out like last year with like a great GPT competitor that was kind of comparable, and everyone's like, okay, cool. And then it got like 50% market share. And then we just see like these two kind of like, I would way rather have them just like misstep, because now, like, they're pushing so hard right now. It's at every part of the company. It's like a major focus. And I think that's where we're going to get, like, that's where these insane budgets are getting dumped, right? Like, we talk about like, oh, it's amazing Microsoft gave OpenAI $10 billion. Like, well, look at what Google's arsenal is at their disposal. Like, if they really are taking this seriously, they're going to be putting more than $10 billion a year into pushing some of these same projects. So I do think that that's going to be exciting. And I hope to see some great things out of Google. I'm slightly jaded, like you mentioned, because of some of their releases. But yeah, I think they'll have some great stuff. Andrew, it has been phenomenal having you on the show today, talking about, you have so much knowledge. We'll have to definitely get you back on. As we wrap this up, what's one piece of advice you feel like you could give people that are getting into the industry, whether that's AI, whether that's data analytics, that you think is really important for them to be focused on?
I would say to start small and not get overwhelmed, and that everybody starts at the beginning, right? It's too easy to try to jump right into it and become discouraged and then say, oh, it's not for me. It is for you. Like, it really is for anybody. Anybody can learn anything, really. So I'd say start small and then incrementally build your success with those topics, and then just keep expanding your abilities.
Amazing. Absolutely love it. If people are interested in following along or looking at the projects you're working on, how do they find you?
Just find me on LinkedIn. Andrew Madson.
Andrew Madson, you're not going to miss him. He's got 80,000 followers. I'm subscribed. I get every single update. This man is an absolute legend if you're interested in data analytics or data analysis, all of that. It's really phenomenal stuff. Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast today. If you enjoyed the episode, it'd mean the world to us. If you left us a review, we'll leave links in the show notes to go find and follow Andrew, and we'll catch you on the next episode.